Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And Shadowlands, it's right around the corner. We're less than 6 weeks away, and it's time to start thinking about picking a main, starting to plan out joining a guild, start out planning to make some friends. I know that part's probably the most intimidating part, but in this review, you don't need to worry about making friends at this point. We're just going to be looking at the Arcane Mage, what has happened, what's coming back baseline, what's changed with the specialization, some of my thoughts on it when it comes to encompassing basically the entire game, PvE, PvP, its fun factor, how long do I think it's going to be an enjoyable spec, basically the whole shebang. And yeah, let's get started. We've got baseline abilities. So what you'll notice when you log into Shadowlands is your spell book will be broken into a mage spell book and an arcane spell book. The mage is available to all mages. So when you look in this, you'll see that arcane has access to fire blast. This is going to be more useful for arcane because before you really only had one school of magic plus ring of frost. So if you're ever interrupted at any point in a boss encounter or in PvP, you pretty much were just stuck there with your hands up in the air. And maybe if you had frost nova, but you might have wanted to save it. So this is a button that you're more or less going to press if you're interrupted on arcane. You're also going to be getting Frostbolt. Now, you have an instant cast slow without needing to cast this. It's a very long cast. So in my mind, I don't see it really ever having a place unless you were interrupted for a really long time. You put Fire Blast on cooldown. You had nothing else to remove Curse. It's likely a button that if you don't want to deal with a lot of keybinds, I think you could honestly just go without keybinding it. If you really wanted it there, you could put it, but functionally, I don't see it really having a strong place. Mirror image is changed to more of a defensive option. While your images are active, you take 20% less damage, but taking direct damage will cause one of your images to dissipate. So a minor defensive cooldown. This is going to be very useful in PvE, especially for just mass hits. I'm thinking like the Shadow of Xavius from back in Legion when you dipped in below 50% health and you just nuked everybody. Obviously, you could ice block that, but this is like a secondary minor effect that you can still attack while it's active. So more personal defense in that regard. Arcane Intellect, just as a minor note, a lot of the scrolls that would replicate this effect are no longer going to be viable. So you're always going to be having a spot in a group just for Arcane Intellect to give 5% intellect to everybody. Just a minor point that I thought was worth bringing forward. When we look at the baseline spells, you're going to notice that displacement is gone. It's replaced with alter time. 500 mana, 1 minute cooldown. You alter the fabric of time, returning to your current location and health when you cast a second time or after 10 seconds. So effectively, you're going to cast alter time right before you would take a lot of damage, or maybe you want to reposition with a bunch of monsters or some players, and then right as it ends or before it ends, you can activate it again to teleport right back to where you started. Super cool defensive ability. Doesn't have any offensive utility, much like its former version from Miss of Pandaria, where it would save your procs and your buffs and you could just get a secondary wave. It's not like that. It's just purely a defensive option. But again, you can't go wrong with more defensive choice. Conjure Mana Gem is back here for Arcane only. So if you're ever having mana problems, you'll just have an immediate instant cast way to regenerate your mana through that gem. When you activate it, you'll instantly restore 10% mana, and it holds 3 charges. You'll notice that Presence of Mind was buffed. It's still 1 minute cooldown, but it causes your next 3 Arcane Blasts to be instant cast. Probably more implications in PvP about this being 3 Arcane Blasts instead of 2 than PvE, but it is still a nice benefit in PvE as well. Arcane Power got nerfed. It's a 2 minute cooldown now, up from 1.5 minutes, but it's off the global cooldown, which is great. So I'll take a little minor nerf for this being off the global cooldown any day. Arcane Barrage is getting an additional passive effect. So obviously this is still the old school barrage. You just shoot it out. It does a bunch of damage based on how many charges you have, but it will also grant you 2% of your maximum mana. So you're likely to have very minimal mana problems moving into Shadowlands. Touch of the Magi is going baseline. I always think of this ability like the Monk Touch of Death, but for mages and a caster. So it's a 1.4 second cast, 45-second cooldown. You apply it to a target, and then all of the damage you do while it's active accumulates 25% of it, and then explodes for that at the end of it. A super cool effect, very similar to the Monk Touch of Death. However, massive AoE damage. Nice having this just as a baseline for more burst potential in both PvE and PvP, opening up the talent row a little bit, which we'll get into now. Amplification received a buff. When you clear cast, Arcane Missiles fires 2 additional missiles. At the moment in the beta, Arcane Missile spam is kind of the go-to in PvP and PvE. So this talent at the moment is pretty much mandatory. However, if you played Arcane throughout Battle for Azeroth, you'll remember Rule of Threes, since that was pretty much mandatory for most of the expansion. Depending on how they tune the mana, you may not need to take this anymore, but Arcane Familiar is just inferior to Amplification. So you're basically trading one cookie cutter talent for a different one on this first talent row. But do note, Arcane Missiles are doing a lot of damage, and your build is likely going to be around Arcane Missiles if it stays like this. Master of Time here has entered the level 25 row, which will reduce the cooldown of your altar time by 30 seconds, and altar time resets the cooldown of your blink when you return to your original location. Trying to bring back the original displacement through this talent. Displacement was a really awesome ability. It's kind of sucks to see it go, and this talent, which kind of sort of brings it back, is competing with Shimmer, which is just kind of mandatory baseline in all content in the game. It lets you continue casting while blinking. You trade off not being able to blink out of stuns, which in certain scenarios is a good benefit, but for the most part, the extra mobility and the extra damage or crowd control that you can cast while using your blink is just superior in all regards. So it is a bit unfortunate. This may have a place if you really needed more defensive cooldowns, but on top of mirror images, prismatic barrier, and ice block, I don't know if that will 100% be the case. I feel like Shimmer is still going to be the go-to. Focus Magic is a 1,000 mana on the level 30 row. 1,000 mana, 40-yard range. It increases the target's chance to critically strike with spells by 5% for 30 minutes. When the target critically hits, your chance to critically hit with spells is increased by 5%, also for 10 seconds. At the moment, it's just not that great, and it's competing with a super buffed up Rune of Power. So Rune of Power, you still can cast it. You place the rune on the ground, 45-second cooldown. It gives you 40% damage while you're standing in it. But a secondary effect is that when you activate Arcane Power, you will also create a Rune of Power at that location. So off global cooldown Arcane Power with a Rune of Power. In my mind, this is going to be pretty much mandatory in PvE, likely also mandatory in PvP to set up really, really big damage. Now, depending on how they tune it, Encounter's Flow is always just going to be a good passive drawback. You don't think about it. You're just getting more damage at all times. But this new version of Rune of Power looks really interesting, and I expect that it's going to be pretty strong. Arcane Echo, a new level 35 talent. Direct damage you deal to enemies affected by Touch of the Magi, causing an explosion that deals 115 arcane damage to nearby enemies. I feel like this is going to be your Mythic Plus go-to. Possibly. It's going to give you single target, turning into AoE, especially during burst moments on the Touch of the Magi. So, but in PvP, it's just kind of meh. I feel like this is more dungeon trash, raid trash, where it's going to be focused the most. Now, Resonance, Arcane Barrage deals 15% increased damage per target hit, and I'm just double checking that we don't see any additional changes to that. So it got a slight buff. It's 15% increased damage, up from 10%. Nice on Arcane Barrage, probably still going to be really good in PvP. And then we have Nether Tempest, which hasn't changed at all. It's still just the good old Nether Tempest. In my mind, maybe in PvP, but the way that it's looking, I think between Arcane Echo and Resonance is kind of where you're going to want to go. Maybe Arcane Echo has good synergies with some of the Covenants when we get to it as well. Chrono Shift, nothing changing here. Still just 50%. And it's pretty much mandatory. 50% slow on the target and a 50% sprint. Really good. It's quite difficult to compete with that. Reverberate and Supernova are not changing. However, Touch of the Magi was replaced by Arcane Orb, so Arcane Orb got bumped up. Arcane Orb is just, it feels right on Arcane in its kit. Supernova and some PvP situations to use as an interrupt, like a knock-up effect is useful. Reverberate, if you really just love mashing Arcane Explosion and dungeon trash mobs, would be good, but I feel like competitively, Arcane Orb is going to be your best choice, and it's still going to fit within the kit really well. Now, because Arcane Orb moved up, a new talent on the level 50 row needs to replace it, and that is an Azerite trait from Battle for Azeroth, Enlightened. Arcane damage dealt while above 70% mana is increased by 8%. Mana regen while below 70% is increased by 20%. At the moment, mana is not a big deal, but I feel like they will tune it to make mana a big deal because that's supposed to be Arcane's thing. If that's the case, then maybe it can compete, and that's a pretty strong maybe, because overpowered is quite literally overpowered. It got nerfed from its live iteration to only 50% increased damage and 50% reduced mana cost, down from 60%, but it is still just pretty much mandatory in all situations. Time Anomaly got Time Warp added to its effect, so at any moment you have a chance to gain Arcane Power and Evocation and gain Time Warp. So they tried to make it a little more cheeky, but it's still just seemingly random. Overpowered is really consistent, lines up excellently with this new Rune of Power. And in my mind, I think Enlightened would only start to compete if mana became a strong issue. But there are kind of just some fundamental problems with it where by the time you ramp up and want to be doing your most amount of damage, you probably fell below 70% mana. So your damage outside of your burst window might be higher, but in PvE, that's probably not going to parse too well. And in PvP, I don't think you're too worried about mana at all. It's just get more damage on that Arcane Power, get your reduced mana costs. There's no changes to the honor talents, nothing new to see here. However, any honor talents that have to do with arcane missiles at the moment seem to be really good, like Arcane Empowerment. Cleric casting can now stack 2 additional times and increase the damage of your arcane missiles by 5% per stack, and cleric casting no longer reduces the mana cost of Arcane Explosion. Basically, it's just missiles, 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 and that's how it's feeling at the moment. Now, let's look at the Covenants. We've got the Kyrians here. We've got the Summon Steward, and this now does work in all content. When you summon in the little Swolkin, he's going to deliver you a vial, which heals you for 20% of your health, removes curses, disease, poisons, and bleed effects. It's going to be really good for countering certain specializations in PvP that have bleeds, like Assassination Rogues and Feral Druids, and even Subtlety Rogues now with the Necrolord Covenant providing all rogues bleed effects. So this has really strong implications in PvP. And if you are also a Dwarf or a Dark Iron Dwarf on top of it, you're going to make it really annoying for those specializations in PvP. In PvE, there are a lot of mechanics in the current raid and even some dungeons where there is a prevalent amount of bleeds, so being able to remove those and assist with your healer is going to be incredibly desirable. When you're going through Torghast, if you plan to run it by yourself, which is like a new solo / group dungeon crawler where you're just climbing up the top of the tower as quickly as possible, if there's any bleeds that might have otherwise killed you, this is going to be a great addition, and on top of having the heal. Probably more importantly, though, to the Kyrian is going to be the Radiant Spark. 1000 mana, 40 yard range, 1.4 second cast, 30 second cooldown. Conjure a Radiant Spark that causes 905 arcane damage instantly and an additional 333 damage over 8 seconds. The target takes 10% increased damage from your direct damage spells, stacking each time they are struck. This effect ends after 4 spells. So you can see the synergies between Touch of the Magi, Arcane Power, and Radiant Spark. So if you were to activate Touch of the Magi and then go for Radiant Spark and then go for Arcane Power, I mean, you've got a huge amount of damage modifiers all stacked up together, and you're pretty much just going to be blasting any target away. Although I should have been pressing missiles, because missiles just hit really hard at the moment. So this seems like a good all-around pick in my mind for Arcane Mage. It seems like it would work in PvE. It's probably not the highest parsing with Necrolords the way they are when we get to them, but in PvP, it's really good. Just gives you a clear window. It might be a bit predictable, though, so you might want to take that into considerations. And some of the secondary benefits from other covenants like the Ventier might outweigh it. However, you can gain other passives through the Soulbind Conduit talent trees for the Kyrian that would provide you stun reductions on yourself. So if you really don't like being stunned, you should take that into consideration for the Kyrian. But overall, when it encompasses the entire game, I feel like it's an above average covenant for the entire game. I don't feel like it's a wrong choice. Now I need to really sneeze. Okay. We got the Night Fae of Ardenweald. We've got the Soul Shape, which is like a Ghost Wolf blink. If you wanted more blinks, 1.5 minute cooldown, turn into a Vulpin, teleport 15 yards forward, and you increase your movement speed by 50% while in the form. And then this one, Shifting Power, which I'm still trying to. I feel like this one could end up being really good, but because it's like one of the few Covenant abilities that doesn't just solely focus on its damage output, it seems a little bit odd. Shifting Power is 2,500 mana. You channel it for 45-second cooldown. It's a 45-second cooldown. Draw power from the ground beneath, dealing 2,500 nature damage over 5.6 seconds to enemies with 15 yards. So it has an AoE component. While channeling, your mage ability cooldowns are reduced by 3 seconds every 1.4 seconds. So if we take this Covenant ability and show it off, we will have the Vulpin, so the teleporting one. Kind of suits Arcane Mage, right? You're just blinking around at all times and even more. But if we use our cooldowns, like our Touch of the Magi, right, and our Arcane Power, and then we start channeling, we could be doing some massive damage, and we would also be reducing those cooldowns. So I'm a bit interested to see how this one plays out. I think of it as like a cooldown evocate. In PvE, it has potential to be really awesome because most of the time you're not going to be disrupted on this. Now, in PvP, if you wanted to get the damage component of it, you're channeling it in a place where you're probably going to be interrupted or stopped, which would just completely nullify the ability when it comes to PvP. And it just seems like there's going to be a lot of math to figure out on if it's going to be functional in PvE. Where I'm trying to think about it would be if there's multiple kind of phases where you get this big arcane power window and then you need another arcane power window before the 2-minute cooldown timer that it's normally got, and you could get it down to that cooldown margin, which is usually like maybe one raid encounter in a raid where this Covenant could be built upon. So in PvP, you'd almost exclusively be using it for the cooldown reduction, which would give you more burst damage. So if Touch of the Magi and Arcane Power end up doing more damage than Radiant Spark, this would be a good pick. Other benefits of the Night Fae are Cheat Death, which does work in Arena at the moment. So when you otherwise would take fatal damage, right, you'll turn into a seed. And then if the seed doesn't die because it has a certain amount of health, you are reborn. So that's a nice little added effect to get, and that's kind of the standout effect for me, at least, from the Night Fae on top of their abilities. So if this seems interesting to you, I think it may be worth trying. However, when it comes to PvP, I would put it much lower than the other options. In PvE, also, it's hard to say where it's going to fit. It either is going to be really awesome and amazing, or it's just going to fall flat and less competitive. It seems interesting, though, and it's definitely unique when in comparison to some of the other options. And if you like the Night Fae, it might be worth checking out. And do remember, if you end up feeling like you made a wrong choice, you will be able to switch to a different Covenant, and there's catch-up mechanics that have been shown so that you'll catch up that other Covenant. So this one might interest you. You want to try it out, and then at the end it doesn't feel right. You should be able to go back and change it. Now the Venthyr, the vampires, you're getting Door of Shadows, which is on Shadow School. So as an Arcane Mage, really important in PvP when you're dealing with interrupts to have more schools of magic. So this is a nice pickup. 1.5 second cast, 1 minute cooldown, and then you can just teleport. You can go up, you can go down, you can go across gaps and holes. Really strong mobility. Probably the strongest mobility in the game in my mind. And then Mirrors of Torment, 2,000 mana, 1.4 second cast, 1.5 minute cooldown. Conjure 3 mirrors to torment the enemy for 20 seconds. Whenever the target casts an ability or spell, a mirror is consumed to inflict 791 shadow damage, and their movement and cast speeds are slowed by 15%. The final mirror will instead inflict 2,090 shadow damage to the enemy, rooting and silencing them for 4 seconds. Now, based on the tooltip, you would almost just outright say, well, that sounds like a PvP ability, right? And Venthyr, deeper in their Soulbind Conduit talents, provides you 25% interrupt reduction. So when it comes to PvP, having this extra mobility, having a really strong silence effect that is dispellable, however, with Unstable Affliction Warlocks the way they are, if you synergize with them, they'll be able to protect your Mirrors of Torment. And then healers get punished very hard in PvP, dispelling unstable affliction. So it would be a big gamble for them to dispel this. And it could also set you up for swaps to healers because it silences. So I'm interested to see how it plays out, but it is standing out as, in my mind, a stronger PvP choice than a PvE one for the Venthyr. And we can test them and look at them. We got the awesome Door of Shadows. You just teleport to the location. You can get crowd control effects on it as well to chain into polymorphs. Really cool ability. And then the Mirrors of Torment. You conjure 3 Mirrors of Torment. And then as they cast abilities, see here that the other downside is if you cast it on a monster that isn't casting any abilities, it's not going to go off. So curious to see how they might maybe alter that for PvE, because at the moment it seems like a PvP only pick, especially when you compare it to the last Covenant, the Necrolords, when we get to it. So Venthyr looking a bit better for PvP. I would say Kyrian looking good for everything in the game. And then Night Fae being a little bit odd, and I'm a bit uncertain with it. Now Necrolord, this is the GOAT for PvE. This part of it, maybe not so much, but Fleshcraft, 2-minute cooldown. You'll start channeling for a shield on yourself, and you can get little passives in the Conduits deeper in the tree that if you channel this on a corpse of a certain monster, it gives you a slight benefit. So you may want to be looking out for that. Could just be some cool gameplay fantasy wise too, if you just want to go through a dungeon in that sense, not looking to be super competitive. But you already do a prismatic barrier. This could be utilized with the ultimate form as well, which is one of their deeper soulbind conduits, which while you're channeling it, you're immune to crowd control. If you complete the channel, you are immune a further 4 seconds to crowd control. So if you know a boss has a certain AoE stun, or a trash pull has a bunch of stuns and maybe a bunch of annoying things jumping on you that stun you over and over, this would be a good counter. You could channel the Fleshcraft right as you know they're about to stun you, and then get to cast for even more seconds. So there's potential for it to be good in PvE. And then in PvP, obviously, casting this before you're anticipating a stun or a polymorph. There's a lot of outplay mechanics with this in PvE and PvP, which does somewhat redeem it as a PvP pick, because Deathborn, which is 2500 mana, 1.4 second cast, 3-minute cooldown, transform into a powerful skeletal mage for 20 seconds. While in the form of a skeletal mage, your Frostbolt, Fireball, and Arcane Blast hit up to 2 enemies near your target, and your spell damage is increased by 10%. Just baking in with the class, making it do massive damage on AoE. And think about like Touch of the Magi with Arcane Echo when you pair that together. But so Fleshcraft, you could be immune to crowd control right now. You complete the channel, you're immune even further. Now you could go for Touch of the Magi, Arcane Power, Deathborn, maybe Deathborn first, and then you would just be pumping. This would just be the most ridiculous amount of damage. Now, it's possible that this could also be really good in PvP, but you would be, what's the word I'm looking for? You would be telegraphing it really hard, because you would have to mash Arcane Blast. And if you want like that old Arcane PvP where you got the fat Arcane Blast in PvP, it would be good. But in my mind, this one seems really good for PvE specifically. You could have some redeeming factors, but Venthyr, man, the 25% interrupt reduction, the mobility, the added offense utility of the silence, seems like it might be a bit better for PvP. But that's it for the Covenants. We've taken a look at the baselines, the talents, the Covenants. Next up, we've got Legendaries. So let's go take a look over here. We've got General Mage Legendaries. So we got the Disciplinary Command. Casting a Frost, Fire, and Arcane spell within 10 seconds of each other increases your critical strike damage of all your spells by 10%. This effect can only occur once every 30 seconds. So trying to like include Frostbolt somewhat in the rotation when you're looking at this. I'm pretty much avoiding this one, especially because crit percent is going to be really low. Your stats are going to be really low. I think you're going to get more benefit from other Legendaries. I don't think there's at any point in the expansion where this ends up being too great, unfortunately. Expanded potential. Your Arcane Blast has a chance to give you expanded potential, which causes your next clear casting to not be consumed. This could be pretty strong, but you're not really using Arcane Blast a lot. I feel like this has better potential if the build is changed from just mashing Arcane Missiles, which I kind of feel like it will. So I definitely have my eyes on this one. This seems like a decent one. Grizzly Icicle. Your Frost, Fire, and Arcane damage against enemies affected by Frost Nova is increased by 10%, no longer breaks it. Could be good in PvP. seems a little bit cheesy. There are a lot of mechanics to remove Frostbolt, Frost Nova. Potentially in Torghast, this could be strong. If you did like a really big pack pull and you wanted to AoE down, but you were worried they might kill you, so this could hold all of them in place. You could kill them. So PvP, but I actually think Torghast more than anything. It's actually a Torghast anima power. So maybe you don't want the legendary because you could just get the anima power for it in there. It could be cheeky. But there's probably better options. Now, the Triune Ward, casting any barrier spell grants the effects of Blazing Barrier, Ice Barrier, Prismatic Barrier. Each absorb has 40% effectiveness, so really good defensive. You gain the other benefits, like melee attackers would hit themselves, reductions in magic effects from the Prismatic, and then also just melee attackers are slowed on their attack speeds. Really defensive option. If you wanted to be a defensive mage, maybe if you're focused more on solo content, random battlegrounds, and you play by yourself, that would be an okay legendary, but I don't feel like competitively it's going to be too great. Now, scrolling down, we've got arcane specific legendaries. We've got the Arcane Bombardment. Arcane Barrage deals an additional 40% damage against targets, both 35%. Really good for execute phase. Seems insane for single target. When it comes to raid bosses, tyrannical, even PvP, this seems like a very good legendary for that in single target situations. Even in AoE, in Fortified, this seems like a good legendary. Like, I don't see any cons in this legendary, like in any content. Arcane Harmony increases the damage done by your arcane missiles by 10%. Each time arcane missile hits an enemy, the damage of your next barrage increased by 2%. This effect stacks. I feel like this is the mandatory legendary at the moment because arcane missiles is so good. It also seems like one where you can't really go wrong with this one. Arcane Harmony or Bombardment. Bombardment seems more fun if you really want to blast people in PvP too, or you want stronger execute phases. But Arcane Harmony is probably just better for consistency's sake. But they seem both good. Siphon Storm. Evocation grants 2 arcane charges, and while channeling evocation, your intellect is increased by 2%. It's a cool effect, but I really don't know about losing a legendary for this. You could, if you ran out of mana, you could evocate back to full mana, then pop all of your cooldowns, and then have that intellect stacked up for it. It's not grabbing me immediately. It seems cool adding this other benefit to evocation, but I wouldn't want to lose a legendary slot for that, I don't think. Temporal Warp. While you have temporal displacements or other similar effects, you may use Time Warp at reduced effectiveness, granting 15% haste. So if you really wanted to run a Time Warp build, you could do that. Would it end up being too great? Seems kind of cheesy. It would be like a really cheesy build. Again, maybe random battlegrounds, maybe solo content. To me, Arcane Harmony and Arcane Bombardment would probably be the ones that you're switching between more often than not. But that's it for the legendaries. We got Conduits coming up next, the new feature of Shadowlands. Think of these as gems. You're going to be putting them into your Covenant's talent trees. You got offense, defense, utility. So potency is offense. And when we look at the Arcane Mages, they've got Arcane Prodigy. Arcane Missiles reduces the cooldown of Arcane Power by 0.1 seconds. That seems really good. That seems amazing. Again, anything to do with Arcane Missiles at the moment is really good. Getting Arcane Power more with the Rune of Power build seems really good. Artifice of the Archmage. Your barrage has a 10% chance to grant 2 arcane charges. Also seems like you can't really go wrong with that. As it's just going to be maxing your charges out over and over again. These all seem very competitive to me, at least. Touch of the Magi accumulates an additional 5% of the damage you deal. That seems really massive as well. Man, this is a tough choice between all of these. Nether Precision, consuming clear casting, increases the damage of your next 2 arcane blasts. Maybe perhaps this one would be sick for the Necrolords. Now I'm trying to think of like Covenant synergies. Necrolords, this seems really good. Touch of the Magi with the Kyrian one with Spark could be really good as well. I don't feel like you can really go wrong. I'm trying to think like PvE, PvP solo content. They all seem really good. Now scrolling down, we've got Covenant specific soulbinds. So these are going to be buffing the Covenant spell. So the Ire of the Ascended, Radiant Spark increases the damage of your spells. Your spells deal to the target by an additional 2%. And note that these level up. You'll level these conduits up. So it's 2% at rank 1, but you go all the way to rank 8. So this could be a really big increase of amount of damage there by the time you max this one out. Siphoned Malice for Venthyr. Each time Mirrors of Torment is consumed, your spell damage is increased by 10% for 10 seconds, stacking 3 times. So this is where it's, I think, is redeeming itself for PvE purposes. Because when I just looked at it baseline, it felt like it would fall short. But casting this on a monster where you then would get 30% increased spell damage seems really good. So if you were worried about wanting to be a PvP main Arcane Mage and then struggling in PvE, I feel like this Conduit will help you transition between all of the content. Gift of the Lich. Deathborn's duration is increased by 3 seconds. Just longer duration of fat arcane blasts. Sounds like a lot of fun. It's just going to come down to tuning and math as to if it parses higher than the arcane specific potency ones, but this one definitely seems fun. Can't go wrong, looking like a badass skeleton. We got the Discipline of the Grove. Night Fae Potency Conduit. Shifting power channels 5% faster, so to try and get through that cooldown reduction window. Does it really help you in PvP? Maybe if this was a super high rank. But shifting power, again, it seems really cool, but it's just, because it's odd, because it's different, it's hard for me to gauge whether or not it's going to competitively be a good option. But having cheat death in PvE and PvP is definitely really nice, and that would be a really big benefit from going Night Fae. Mage Endurance Conduits. So we've got defense, we've got the Cryo Freeze. While inside Ice Block, you heal for 20% of your maximum health over the duration. Really good for everything in the game. Just getting an extra heal, especially solo content and PvP, but definitely really good for everything. Your barriers heal you for 20% of the damage absorbed. Might be really good with that Triune Legendary, where you apply all 3 barriers. So you would get a really big heal if you wanted to be doing solo Torghast or, again, solo Battlegrounds, kind of a solo mage, a dueler. That would have really good synergy there. It would be okay in PvE, although I feel like you're not mashing Prismatic Barrier that much in PvE. But this would be good in all situations. Tempest Barrier. You gain a shield that absorbs 5% of your maximum health for 15 seconds after you blink. Okay, so pretty minor shield there. So it's like get a really significant heal on a long cooldown, get a moderate heal on a moderate cooldown, get a tiny heal on a tiny cooldown. That's kind of your choices there. So in my mind, going the middle of the road might be the best. Just getting a heal every time you barrier. Might also be really good with the way Prismatic Barrier works. So for Arcane, I feel like this one's standing out a bit more. Mage Finesse Soulbind Conduits, the utility portion of this. Flow of Time. The cooldown of Blink is reduced by 1 second. Okay, well, if you had a reduced cooldown Blink and you went that one, maybe those synergize really well together. Incantation of Swiftness. Invisibility increases your movement speed by 20%. It's kind of meh. It's a really long cooldown. Winter's Protection. The cooldown of Ice Block is reduced by 30 seconds. That would be unexpected for people in PvP. Getting this immunity cooldown for 2 big raid damage cycles would be awesome in raids. This is probably the go-to for PvE, at least from what I've seen so far. Grounding Surge. Successfully interrupting an enemy with counterspell reduces its cooldown by 1 second. Oh man, if you leveled this up, what would your counterspell cooldown? Counterspell is already pretty much the strongest single target interrupting game, if not one of them at least. That seems good for everything. I don't know why you wouldn't want to go that. Unless you're somebody who doesn't have counterspell on their bar, then you don't really care about it. You just want more blinks, more blinky blinks. Then you probably go for that. But this seems really good in terms of competitive options. And that's pretty much it for the Arcane Mage. We reviewed Conduits, we reviewed talents, we reviewed baseline abilities, we reviewed Legendaries. It seems like Arcane is getting a lot back. Some of the downsides are losing displacement, like the cool effects you could use displacement with. That's definitely a downside, but getting more schools of magic is going to enable Arcane a lot here. Getting buffs to their reductions to their global cooldowns. It seems like Arcane's going to be in a really good spot, I would think, for PvE and PvP. It seems like a solid spec overall. It's definitely intrigued me more than it has in the past, because I've never really been an Arcane Mage player. Whenever I'm playing my mage, I'm usually Frost. If Frost isn't competitive, then I will play Fire, but I generally like Frost. However, some of the changes to Arcane is definitely intriguing me to give it a shot. Even myself, I haven't decided what I'm going to be maining yet in Shadowlands, and if you haven't either, but that would be basically my initial assessment. It seems good. It seems competitive. It seems like a lot of cool stuff is coming back to it. Baseline, sure, you get receiving some minor nerfs, but that's compensated with some GCD changes as well as some buffs to some other abilities. So overall, it looks really good. I'm liking the Arcane Mage. If you want to leave a comment down below and give your thoughts about the Arcane Mage, please feel free. If you like the video, please give the video a thumbs up, as that helps out greatly. And subscribe to the channel because I'm uploading content daily. I'm getting tier lists. I'm giving rankings. I'm giving reviews. I'm trying to get everything that I could possibly conceive for you to know to make the right decision when it comes to your gameplay in Shadowlands on this channel. So if you think I'm deserving of your sub, please toss it over to me. I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.